Today, we meet the Pilgrims they left behind. I'm your trainer, Lori Coffee, and I'm thrilled to be able to share with you my favorite people from world history and my family, some of them from my family. The Mayflower Pilgrims, who are world famous. But what about those who didn't make it on that fateful voyage? Let's go back 12 or so generations to learn the little known backstory of the heroes who allowed the Pilgrims the freedom to travel. Some were imprisoned, some were needed by the flock, and some were even left behind at the shore, but many were able to come over on later ships. These unsung heroes allowed the Mayflower Pilgrims to have their spotlight in history. Now we turn the spotlight on them. In England, especially at Cambridge University, cracks within the newly created Protestant Church of England are forming. One of the foremost leaders to purify the church, William Perkins, says, "Churchmen should be distinguished by their doctrines and not their garments, their conversations, not their dress, their purity of mind, not their adornment of person." One of the translators of the King James Version of the Bible, Dr. Lawrence Chatterton, calls the church a huge sorcery, charming and blaspheming the holy name of God, swearing and profaning the Lord's Sabbath, showing contempt of inferiors, doing murder, fornicating, lying. They are nothing but arrogant hypocrites. William Brewster has been educated at Cambridge to learn about the Bible and the law. He sees the cracks his peers are complaining about. Divinity students are acting like frat boys, not devouring the Holy Scripture, and he fears for his church as well. This begins his spiritual search for truth. William Brewster, the first of the Mayflower Pilgrims, is not left behind. After a stint in the British diplomatic service in Holland, he and his wife Mary start their family and name their children based on their religious persecution. First, Jonathan, no persecution. Then they have daughters Patience and Fear just before they flee to Holland. These three pilgrims will be left behind. Then Love, and finally Wrestling, who were not left behind. At 27, the oldest, Jonathan, is making his way as a ribbon maker and exporter in Leiden. Plus, he helps with their growing church. After he marries, the Mayflower leaves him behind because his wife is sick after giving birth to their son. Both soon die after that. But Jonathan does come to America a year later on the small ship Fortune with 33 other pilgrims who were left behind, like Thomas Prince. Jonathan is an active member of the colony for the rest of his 65 years. He serves as a surveyor and lays out highways. Called a gentleman, he practices as an attorney. He serves as deputy to the general court. As military commissioner, he helps to raise forces when needed. He establishes a ferry service and is the master and owner of a coasting vessel, plying as far south as Virginia. Jonathan marries Lucretia Oldham, sister to Captain John Oldham, who we'll hear more about later. They have 8 children, 47 grandchildren, and grow old together. A great start to building up a weakened colony. He and Lucretia and the first 2 children appear in the first complete census of the Pilgrims, the 1627 Cattle Division, along with Thomas Prince and Patience, the Brewsters' first daughter. She comes on the Anne in 1623 with 74 other pilgrims left behind, and marries Thomas Prince, who will become the 4th governor of the colony. They have 4 children, starting with Rebecca, then Thomas, Hannah, and Mercy, with 20 grandchildren. The Brewster's second daughter, Fear, also comes on the Anne and marries Mayflower pilgrim and widower Isaac Allerton, an entrepreneur 20 years her senior, with 3 children already. Fear is such a loving stepmother, her little stepdaughter, Mary, will name her own daughter Fear. And Fear's son, Junior, graduates from Harvard in the class of 1650, and becomes a leader in Virginia, including a stint as a major in the militia. He serves under Colonel John Washington, great-grandfather of our first president. It's kind of cool. But before the Brewsters ever leave England, at their home, Scrooby Manor, William's family learns about the forbidden Bible from dissident ministers. But Richard Clifton, the grave and fatherly old man with the great white beard, is their favorite. Even Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister, enjoys the illuminating ministry of Mr. Clifton. As one of the architects of the Pilgrim's vision, Pastor Clifton was a Brownist, not a brownie. What's a Brownist? Someone influenced by the radically unorthodox priest Robert Brown from Christ College at Cambridge, who says, create your own religion, Christian religion, based simply on the Holy Bible. He is repeatedly jailed for this controversial idea, along with many of his followers. For 200 years, they were not called Pilgrims, but Brownists. Here's a fun fact. In the 12th Night, Shakespeare said, I would rather be a Brownist with all that jail time than a politician. I think that's pretty funny. Considered the most creative religious thinker of his day, Brown's leadership, while brief, laid the foundation upon which the others, including Richard Clifton, would build. What did he do that was so controversial that his followers abandoned him? He renounced them and went back to the Church of England. Pastor Clifton and his loyal Brownists have two main complaints with the Church of England: their church hierarchy, which is not described in the Bible, and the Book of Common Prayer, which has displaced the Bible in the church by command of the crown. So the Pilgrims used the 1599 Geneva Bible, printed in England. It is the first to have numbered verses, making it easier to discuss. And it includes study notes. This allows anyone who can read to comprehend God's word without that pesky middleman called the priest. In 1603, when Queen Elizabeth dies, King James VI of Scotland inherits her crown and becomes King James I of England. He reviews his new country's religious disharmony. He was raised a Presbyterian, but now is the head of the Church of England. By 1611, he has banned the Geneva Bible as seditious, with its dangerous study notes, which says that even kings should bow down to the Lord. He replaces it with his own version of the Bible, known as what? The King James version, KVI, right? He thinks this will satisfy his rebellious subjects. But it doesn't work with the second pilgrim left behind and the Pilgrim's next favorite dissident minister, youthful John Robinson. He has earned a master's degree at Cambridge studying the Bible and will debate its meaning with anyone who challenges him. He never loses. As a result, he gains a reputation as the Bible scholar who says he has a burning desire shut up in my bones to separate from the church. John Robinson, servant of the word, is influenced by the Pilgrim's second influencer, John Smith, also of Christ College at Cambridge. An early baptizer, Smith renounced the Church of England in 1606 and becomes the rebellious minister for a group of rebellious separatists in Lincolnshire, a 2-day walk from Nottinghamshire, where John Robinson is. Pastor Robinson is definitely a fan. Together, they organize the separatists in the area around Scrooby. The first pilgrims from Scrooby. Remember the home of William Brewster and his family? Under the cover of darkness, William, Mary, and their older children learn about the forbidden Bible from John Robinson, Richard Clifton, and John Smith. They invite friends to join them in these illegal religious meetings called conventicles. Radical nonconformists of all visions are inciting rebellion within the established church by finding new ways to interpret the Bible. They share their ideas under penalty of persecution, prison, and even death, like martyrs John Penry, Henry Barrow, and John Greenwood. The first pilgrim leaders don't want that for their followers and agree they must protect them from English persecution by escaping to the Netherlands. The first faction of pilgrims become known as the Saints, or separatists, who separate from the Church of England to start their own congregational religion. By 1608, 30 families, never named, secretly pack their belongings and furtively travel to Amsterdam with all its freedoms. Richard Clifton leads the thinking of the group and writes extensively about what it means to be a pilgrim. Yet when the group grows too big for the city, he chooses to stay in Amsterdam and dies there 4 years before the Mayflower sails. Their ever-growing congregation moves an 8-hour boat ride south to the university town of Leiden, with Pastor John Robinson at the helm, where they live peacefully for 12 years. John Robinson's theme of unity helps to grow their congregation to 300. They don't meet at this church, the official Dutch church. This was their view of it. They meet nearby in the courtyard in Stink Alley. In 1611, the pastor buys Greengate, a grand house where his family lives on the second floor, and on the first floor, with a spacious courtyard, the congregation meets on Sundays and Thursdays. Over time, it becomes known as Englishgate, likely due to the 21 apartments they build in the courtyard. Can you imagine them living next door to you? Now there's 21 apartments there for their poor English congregants. Pastor Robinson has married Bridget White, whose sisters, Jane, Catherine, and Frances, are also involved in the church. 3 sisters will be left behind. Frances does not even leave England, where she and her husband, Francis Jessup, stay and raise their family. Jane does leave England for Leiden, where she marries Ralph Thickens, but they never make it to Plymouth. John and Bridget have 9 children in Leiden, happy marriage, who survive infancy, and several more who don't. They intend to make the Atlantic crossing as soon as it's financially feasible to bring the rest of the flock. Pastor Robinson doesn't want to leave anyone behind. He has influenced all the leaders of the Pilgrims, like John Carver, who is not left behind and will become the Pilgrims' first elected governor in the New World. As the pastor's trusted deacon, he also becomes family by marrying the pastor's sister-in-law, Catherine. She is the one who gets to go. A lot of good it will do her, though. As a popular midwife, Catherine has helped with countless pilgrim births, sometimes assisted by Sarah Willett Minter, also a midwife. Her husband, William, dies, leaving their daughter, Desire, technically an orphan, even though her mother is living. Sarah remarries to Roger Simonson, but he also dies. Then she remarries to Roger Eastman, and he insists that Desire, now a teenager, needs a guardian. Guardian rules detail that he will cover her costs until she turns 21, build her 1,900 guilders inheritance with interest, that's $77,000 today, arrange for her education, and find her a suitable husband who will match her 77K dowry. Should the guardian leave Leiden, he needs to appoint someone else. Roger Eastman asked fellow parishioner, philanthropist, and Willett family friend, Thomas Brewer, originally from Boxley in Kent, to serve. Since he and his first wife, Anna Offley, has set up a similar agreement for their daughter, Mercy, with John Carver. Thomas and his second wife, Macchio, agree. Macchio is a French-speaking Walloon. Have you heard of that before? I had to look that one up. Before Huguenots, or Huguenots, if you're French, you say Huguenot, but the Huguenots, they were French Protestants who escaped French Catholic death squads by running to Wallonia in Belgium and to the Netherlands. Then the 80 Years' War brings Spanish invaders to the Netherlands with their own death squads. The Walloons who are able flee to England. In 1609, when the 12-year truce is finally signed, many Walloons returned to the Netherlands to escape English persecution. They had it bad. The truce was due to end in 1621, prompting the Pilgrims to move to the New World now, including some Walloons. Thomas and Macchio have a grand house in Leiden. Living with them are 3 Willets. Thomas, called a brother in the tax record, perhaps they share a mother. Hester, called a sister, and Rebecca Willett, married to Daniel Fairfield, with their sons. Also, Stephen Tracy and his wife, Tryphosia Lee, live with them, but all of them are left behind. And Thomas Willett alone eventually moves to Plymouth and builds a second house in New Amsterdam. Clearly, the family has money and a good relationship with the Dutch. Thomas Brewer is also a friend of William Brewster. It's very confusing. It's Thomas Brewer and William Brewster, both teaching at the University of Leiden and conducting business together with their side hustle. They have created the publishing company Vicus Corelli Press. You have to say it like that. Vicus Corelli, which is memorialized with a plaque in Leiden still. What does Vicus Corelli mean? If you know Latin, you know. It means the vicar sings. To the pilgrims in the English church, the vicar, or representative of the bishop, would sing specific portions of the Sunday message to make it more memorable. Kind of like A, B, C, D, E, right? To help you remember the words. Later called the Pilgrim Press, the publishing company is still in business. Isn't that amazing? Vicus Corelli Press has produced a book called Perth Assembly that's critical of King James, which makes both Brewster and Brewer wanted men by the king's spies in Leiden. Brewster escapes and hides out in England for 2 years before the Mayflower sails. Thomas Brewer turns himself in, allowing the university to reopen their doors. He was their ransom. English henchman Sir William Zouch takes custody of Brewer and writes to his boss, "The gentleman seems very ready and willing to go with me." Despite the tone of Perth Assembly, Brewer is expecting a good outcome. His pastor, John Robinson, accompanies prisoner Brewer as he is taken to Rotterdam to sail to England for trial. While waiting for sailing weather, Zouch reports that Brewer has many influential visitors, such as the three brothers Teelink, all Dutch officials, plus the chief recon master, who will speak to the Prince of Orange on Brewer's behalf. Sounds like a good deal. Zouch then delivers Brewer into English custody, where he remains for just over 4 months as the process begins. He is released when he promises to pay for his own return to Leiden. The Vicus Corelli type and papers are now in English custody. Before Mayflower leaves, Thomas Brewer knows he will be left behind while he navigates the English prison system. So he asks John and Catherine Carver to take the guardianship of Desire Minter, who agree. Then Brewer is thrown into King's Bench prison for 14 years before finally being released. Fortunately, he is allowed to write letters and conduct business while imprisoned, like helping Isaac Allerton, Brewster's son-in-law, with the buyout of the Pilgrims' harsh contract in 1626. John and Catherine Carver take Desire to the New World, along with Jasper Moore and servants John Howland, Roger Wilder, and Dorothy, last name unknown. But John and Catherine both die in the spring, leaving Desire Minter unguardianed. She returns to family on the fortune and likely dies before she's 21 because there's no record of that inheritance. Now it's time for the Pilgrims to leave the Netherlands. They have to say goodbye to those they are leaving behind. Eyewitnesses write that they were not able to speak for the abundance of sorrow, sobs, and prayers. Pastor Robinson gives a sermon seeking of the Lord a right way for us, for our little ones, and for all our substance. Once the saints board the ship, on the shore, the pastor falls to his knees sobbing, followed by the rest who are also left behind. In England, while the travelers are still aboard ship waiting to leave, his first letter arrives to remind them to forge a relationship with the strangers from London who are traveling with them, to get along in spite of their differences. "How do we do that, Pastor?" "To be successful," he wrote, "you need to show a loving forbearance. In other words, show patience with a smile. You need to avoid taking offense at trifles. Don't sweat the small stuff. And to subordinate your own interests to the common good, or share in the effort to care for everyone's needs." Such good advice, Mahatma Gandhi quoted him, and Kennedy quoted Gandhi. Ask not what your country can do for you. Remember that? You won't remember, you're too young. But ask what you can do for your country. John Robinson's inspiring letter also describes them as a body politic, using civil governance, and no one is of special eminence above you to be chosen by you, entirely with love and for promoting the common good. Can you imagine if everyone went to the vote with that in their hearts? How different our elections would be. This led to their 1620 agreement between the planters that we call the Mayflower Compact, one of the foundational documents of democracy. God bless you, please, Mr. Robinson. His wisdom continues to feed the colony until February of 25, when he becomes ill, but recovers enough to preach twice the next day. A week later, at 49, he dies. As a sign of respect, the nearby St. Peter's Kirk allows his body to be interred there, even though he never preached there or even attended services. His influence on the Pilgrims and their neighbors is felt long after he passed. That civil body politic has become we the people. Makes my heart sing. But in Plymouth, after the news of Pastor Robinson's death, the Mayflower Pilgrims begin to lose their hope for the future that had helped them survive those first grim years. With every new ship, they fear that all they have gained religiously might be destroyed. Even these dark thoughts will turn malicious. We'll hear about that later. Let's go back to Kent. Not the person, the place in England, to meet another important pilgrim left behind. Second son of Thomas and Ellen Couchman, at 18, Robert Cushman is an apprentice to a grocer making tallow candles. That's a stinky job. And like William Brewster, he is a spiritual seeker. Under the cover of darkness, Robert attends illegal conventicles. Remember those illegal religious meetings? In Canterbury, a haven for Puritans. As early as 1604, Cushman finds the Church of England wanting and defective. In other words, it falls short of his expectations. Instead of attending church, he posts libels on the doors like Martin Luther. Libels are handwritten leaflets that simply read, "Lord, have mercy upon us." As a result, he is prosecuted and excommunicated from the church every time he is caught. And he is caught every time he posts them. He doesn't care. Finally, in 1611, he escapes from England with his wife Sarah and young son Thomas to Leiden. Sadly, Sarah dies. So, as pilgrims are wont to do, in 1617, the now woolcomber Robert weds Mary Singleton, with Catherine Carver as a witness. Mary, of course, helps to raise young Thomas, while Robert is called away on business by Pilgrim leadership. Robert is chosen as chief agent due to his business experience to partner with John Carver, chosen for his pious and good nature. Their 3-year mission that they had to accept to organize their move to the New World. First stop, London, to negotiate financing. Brewster and Robinson prepare required articles of belief for them to take to the potential moneymen, saying that while religiously radical, they are indeed obedient to the word of God. Because of the ambiguity of the wording, it causes suspicions in London, which causes heartburn in Leiden. In London's former Holy Trinity Priory, which during the recent Reformation has become an apartment building called Heneage House, Duke's Place, and it's still called that today, they find a wheeler dealer, Thomas Weston, with experience in both the Netherlands and London in finding financial whales. Lots of money. Later, they learn that his guiding principle is to make money regardless of the consequences, which makes him more skilled at promise than performance. Nevertheless, they ask him to find investors to pay for their exodus. Who he finds is Sir Edwin Sandys, whose second great-grandfather, William, served in the court of Henry VIII. And his father, Edwin Sr., the Archbishop of York, was the Brewsters' patron, with financial and other support for Scrooby Manor. Sir Edwin is an elected member of Parliament and governor of the First Virginia Company, famous for his guiding principle, honesty is the best policy, which he coined. That's pretty cool, huh? How about differences? Diametrically opposed. Sir Edwin was also helped to get elected by our own Thomas Brewer before he moves to the Netherlands. So the Pilgrims and Sir Edwin have history. He gets him a patent for land on the Hudson River, as requested, then gathers 70 or so investors called the Merchant Adventurers. They ask King James for permission to go. He asks about how they plan to make money there. Fishing is the answer, although they forget to pack fishing hooks. The king declares, "So God have my soul, 'tis an honest trade. It was the apostles' own calling." But after a year of negotiating with the king's bishops, James will only give his blessing verbally, without an officially sealed document. Then copies of Perth Assembly are discovered in Scotland, sending Brewster into hiding and Brewer into prison. Many potential pilgrims drop out at the shaky start for their endeavor. Thanks to Weston, internal negotiations begin to turn contentious. Cushman and Carver are quarreling with him and then with each other over finances, contractual terms, shipping, provisions, and even leadership for the journey, to the point where Cushman notifies Pilgrim leadership of the schism between them. The moneymen, or London merchant adventurers, are not angel investors. They charge as much as 30% interest, as much as a high interest credit card today. And they expect the Pilgrims to work 7 days a week. The Pilgrims refuse to sign the agreement, but plan to start boarding passengers anyway. Finally, something they can agree on. Cushman and Weston go to prepare the Mayflower, and Carver returns to the Netherlands to purchase the Speedwell. The Speedwell, a small and aging ship, will be theirs to keep for fishing and coastal trade when they get to the New World. Great idea. Robert Cushman and his family will lead members of the Leiden congregation aboard the Speedwell. This ship will carry the saints. Speedwell leaves from Delfshaven in the Netherlands. Mayflower, loaded with paying customers from London, leaves from Rotherhithe on the Thames. The adventurers are looking for more people to help plant the new colony and to help pay for the voyage, since the saints have very little money. Buy a one-way ticket with cash or 7 years hard labor and get 200 acres of land. By the way, it turns out to only be 1 acre with that hard labor, but these London strangers are happy to get it. The strangers are all religious too, but as loyal members of the Church of England. Uh-oh, isn't that what the saints are running from? They join up in Southampton for supplies. This is the first time the saints meet the strangers and read John Robinson's inspirational letter. But 3 times the smaller ship can't keep up when they put to sea. The Speedwell cannot be trusted to cross the Atlantic. They put in for repairs in Plymouth. But the Speedwell is leaking like a sieve, writes Cushman. He is concerned that half their food will be eaten up before they ever leave England. Many want to abandon the voyage, losing everything. Thankfully, the crew forces them to stay. 5 weeks of food being eaten, 5 weeks of seasickness, 5 weeks of fear of capture. Stress? It finally catches up with him, and he begins to feel a bundle of lead crushing my heart. He is preparing to die as the Speedwell is abandoned. The 120 original passengers combine into 102 who squeeze aboard the Mayflower. 18 are left behind, including Robert Cushman, who expects at any moment to become meat for ye fishes. He actually writes that. My mother would have called him a nervous Nelly. However, fully alive, he waves goodbye from dry land as his work is not done yet. He continues working for the Pilgrims in London, making arrangements for 35 of those left behind to come over on the Fortune with him and his young teenage son, Thomas. These passengers help with the manpower shortage caused by that winter of death. This is when Jonathan Brewster and Thomas Prince arrive, remember? Plus others like John Winslow, who we'll hear about later. They arrive in Plymouth on November 9th, 1621, with barely any supplies. Only more mouths to feed, as William Bradford complains. This is the Pilgrims' year of starvation. Cushman is sent to do one job: get the adventurers' new agreement signed. He gives the first sermon in New England, a moving and effective message, another ask not what your country can do for you moment. They sign the agreement, and he returns home on fortune. A U-turn. He left his son behind. But it is hijacked by a French warship in sight of the English Channel. The privateers hold Cushman and the other passengers for a month in a French prison. They take all their goods except the signed agreement and the embellished telling of their adventures so far, that Cushman gives to George Morton to publish before he comes over on the next ship. Called Mort's Relation, it is Pilgrim PR. Cushman continues working on the Pilgrims' behalf in London and Leiden until his death in 1625, at only 48. Although he is buried in Kent, England, in 1858, his Pilgrim descendants erect a towering granite column in his honor in Plymouth. Pilgrim descendants? He wasn't on the Mayflower. He wasn't a pilgrim. How could his descendants be? His only son, Thomas, is a young teen on the Fortune, remember? While little Mary Allerton traveled on the Mayflower and is stepdaughter to Fear Brewster Allerton, remember? She names her own daughter Fear. After they grow up, they fall in love and marry. So don't forget the women when you're doing genealogy. She's my ancestor. Staying in Plymouth, they will eventually have 8 children, one of whom named Fear, and one of whom is my ancestor. Plus, they will have 55 grandchildren. Also on the Fortune is William Palmer with his son, William Jr. He writes his wife, Frances, to join them later. As a man who makes nails, the colony is thrilled to have him join them. He brings bellows, anvil, vise, and all the tools necessary for nail making. Another woman left behind who comes over on the Anne is widow Christiana Penn, who marries Pilgrim widower Francis Eaton and raises Samuel, his baby Pilgrim. Then they have 3 children together, including one with special needs. When Francis dies, Christiana marries Pilgrim Wildchild, Frances Billington, who of course helps to raise her kids, and they have 8 children together. It's a big family. One of whom is my ancestor, and one of whom marries baby Samuel. Very happy family. The merchant adventurers finally send the people and supplies that the Pilgrims were awaiting on the Anne, which arrives July 10th, 1623, and its consort, the smaller Little James, which arrives 10 days later. They planned to use Little James for fishing and cargo service, but they didn't plan for it to be confiscated upon arrival and sent back to England in a bankruptcy case. Captain John Oldham arrives with his wife, Jane Bissell, children Richard, Mary, and Junior, plus his sister Lucretia, who marries Jonathan Brewster, remember? Traveling with Brewster's sisters, Fear and Patience. Elizabeth Warren, with her 5 daughters, arrive. We'll hear more about them in a minute. But first, let's meet Esther Cook and her 4 kids. Esther. An early escapee from England, Pilgrim Francis Cook, woolcomber, left his wife, Esther Lemehu, and 4 children behind. As we just saw, they all arrive on the Anne. Based on Esther's name, where do you think she's from? Like Macchio Brewer, she too is a French Walloon, a French Protestant who escapes the Spanish death squads, as is her nephew, Philip Delanois. His French name becomes Delano. Sound familiar? A presidential direct descendant. Let's take a little detour to see the mindset of the Pilgrims. Remember, they arrive as 2 factions, saints and strangers, which begins to dissolve as they have to work together to survive those first grim years. But then more ships keep arriving, which reminds me of when I was the new kid in school dealing with cliques. Those are the cliques. The original Mayflower Pilgrims now call themselves the Planters, since they've planted the new colony. They are like the cliques who get to determine the rules. Those who arrive on the Fortune and Little James, Charity, and Swan are now called the Old Comers. because they follow the rules the cliques have set down. They get to partake in some of the spoils of labor, like the cattle division. Everyone who comes after that are the newcomers, who don't necessarily care about the rules and are often rebuked for it. Many of the original pilgrims follow these independent thinkers, though, and the colony begins to break up as new towns are created. While life was difficult with all this turmoil in Plymouth, it wasn't easy being the family left behind either. John Craxton brought his teenage son John Jr. on the voyage, but left behind his wife Catherine Bates and grown daughter Anna, friends with Patience Brewster, and married to Thomas Smith in Leyden. Unfortunately, by 1628, all four had died, including John Craxton Jr., of frostbite. A successful camlet merchant, Thomas Rogers, and his wife Alice Cosford have 4 children in Leyden. Do you know camlet? Have you ever heard of that? I had to look that one up. It's a luxury fabric made of silk and camel hair. Thomas sells the family home and business before he and his oldest son Joseph leave, while he plans for Alice, John, Elizabeth, and Margaret, who are left behind, to eventually join him. Unfortunately, like half of the Pilgrims, Thomas dies that first winter. Without a home or means, Alice and the 3 younger children end up in debtor's prison, where Alice dies. Happily, young Joseph survives and brings his 3 siblings to Plymouth by 1630. That's cool. Did you know that? I know all the Pilgrims, but I didn't know this backstory. I was so glad to research it. Another Alice is a popular daughter of Alexander Carpenter, a pilgrim who chooses to stay in Leyden. This Alice has been courted by both William Bradford, an orphan corduroy weaver, and Edward Southworth, a silk worker who claims he is related to royalty. Guess which one she marries? Edward, the royal guy, and has 2 sons, Constant and Thomas, who were only 4. Thomas was only 4 when the Mayflower leaves without the family, possibly because Edward was sick, as Alice becomes a widow soon after. Second choice William Bradford ends up marrying his second choice, Dorothy May, niece of fellow pilgrim William White, and brings her to the New World. After safely arriving in Plymouth Harbor, this is one of the most tragic events to happen in a winter full of tragedy. On the voyage, Dorothy is still despondent about their 4-year-old son, Jonathan. Remember back in England when they combined onto the Mayflower? William Bradford quickly decides to leave their child behind, a 4-year-old. Instead, he gives her little Jasper Moore to help take care of. The last sound Dorothy hears as they leave port is little Johnny's mournful wailing for his mother. Imagine her heartbreak remembering that painful goodbye. Then little Jasper dies. He's the second sibling in his family to die while traveling without either parent. Any guesses why? Both parents were living. It was human trafficking, promoted by Sir William Zouch. Remember him with Thomas Brewer? His secretary was their father, Richard Moore Sr. Well, he wasn't biologically their father, who was never at home and never worried about his wife, Catherine, having children without him, because that was their agreement so that he could keep the family estate. Then neighbors started gossiping about how the kids looked like Jacob Blakeway, her neighbor and original husband. Because of the embarrassment, Moore Sr. promptly kicks her out of the family, hiding her children from her. Then pays Thomas Weston to place them on the Mayflower to their expected doom, while Catherine is left fighting for their Plymouth inheritance. That's her fighting. Only Richard foils his father's devious plan and survives to inherit all 4 land allotments in Plymouth that his mother had fought for, growing up to become an intercoastal ship's captain. But first, in England, Catherine is still working hard to find them in the New World, while Sir William's henchmen continue to fight her. After 2 years of trying and with little recourse or means, Catherine finally gives up the search. So now we have a small son left behind and the mother of small children left behind, both against their will. Just after little Jasper Moore dies, Dorothy Bradford inexplicably slips overboard and drowns. Bradford, who is out exploring with the men, barely mentions it in his diary. He quickly writes to widow Alice, calling for her to come and marry him. She arrives on the Anne without her boys or Jonathan, who eventually comes to the New World but never has a relationship with his father. After their first elected governor, John and Catherine Carver, die, William Bradford is elected governor, on and off, for 30 years. He reigns longer than many British kings. With Alice, they have 3 children. Plus, they take in many of the young orphan men, including Joseph Rogers, Thomas Cushman, and William Latham, plus the Mortons who come over on the Little James, and whose mother, Juliana, is Alice's sister. Her first husband, George Morton, who published Mort's Relation, Pilgrim PR, remember, dies shortly after arriving. She then marries Manasseh Kempton, proving that life for women coming to the New World could change on a dime. For example, the very pregnant Martha Ford, who comes with her husband William, plus baby Mary, was one of only 3 women on the Fortune. On the voyage, she first becomes a widow and then a new mother before they even disembark. Can you imagine? Fortunately, Pilgrim Peter Brown, with his enormous sheepdog, steps in to take on the duties of husband and stepfather, and 2 years later, with the birth of Priscilla, loving father. Anthony Annibal, one of the faithful who joined Robinson in the tearful goodbye, follows on the Anne with his wife Jane and toddler Sarah. While Anthony couldn't sign his name when he first arrived, he learns to read and write in Plymouth, likely at the hand of William Brewster. Later, he becomes one of the leading lawmakers in the entire colony, with his signature appearing on countless deeds and documents. Let's hear a happy sibling story. It begins in Winslow, Arizona, and an Eagles song. You know that song, Standing on a Corner? Well, that part comes much later. Okay. Our story starts with Edward Winslow, typesetter and assistant to Thomas Brewer and William Brewster's Ficus Corelli Press, and later colony ambassador, plus his younger brother Gilbert, who are not left behind. But Gilbert returns to England and dies there without heirs in 31. Their brothers left behind include John, who arrives in Plymouth on the Fortune, marries Mayflower orphan Mary Chilton, and becomes quite successful as a merchant and ship owner, moving to Boston in 57. Then brothers Ken Elm and Josiah likely arrive on the White Angel in 31. Both are early settlers of Marshfield. Ken Elm is a furniture maker, shipping his wares throughout New England, likely on Brother John's ship. He marries Ellen Adams, and they have 4 children. Josiah is the youngest and best-looking brother. I created all these images, so I'm going to make him the best-looking one because he's my ancestor. While hired to be an accountant, like me, he never fully grasps the details. But as an educated farmer with apple orchards and books, he thrives, marries Margaret Bourne, and has 3 children, one of whom is my ancestor. By the way, the original Edward Winslow is the only portrait that's done from life for a pilgrim, the only one. Another band of brothers are the Conants. Maybe you know that name. First to arrive is Christopher, a grocer on the Anne in 1623. Then Roger Conant, a master dry salter that they desperately need for their fishing industry, likely arriving on the Charity a few months later. Roger will greatly influence the history of New England. If you've ever been to Salem, you've seen his statue. After John Robinson dies, the London adventurers send to Plymouth a new minister, John Lyford, who was welcomed at first, but soon a division forms between the separatists, who want to fully separate from the Church of England, and the Puritans, who simply want to purify the church of the kinds of problems their early descent ministers preached about. Lyford supports the Puritan faction, meeting with them in secret. One of Lyford's supporters, Captain John Oldham, brother to Jonathan Brewster's wife, Lucretia, as you may recall, was forced to run a gauntlet while pilgrims beat him with the butt ends of their muskets as a punishment for following this new pastor. Hello, they sent him. But then they banished the captain from the colony. Edward Winslow and William Bradford approve of this punishment. The adventurers do not, calling the pilgrims contentious, cruel, and hard-hearted. After these harsh actions, Roger Conant leaves Plymouth to establish the town of Salem, which also becomes Peabody, Beverly, and Danvers, Massachusetts, where many of the Pilgrims follow. Conant's leadership provides the stability to survive their first 2 years away from the mothership in Plymouth. Then John Endicott replaces him. Conant the dry salter graciously steps aside and is granted 200 acres of land with their thanks. He dies 20 years before the Salem witch trials. He has nothing to do with that. That statue in Salem is thanking him for his leadership, not accusing him. I'm sorry. I know his descendant. He took me on a tour, and his name is also Roger Conant. Captain John Oldham recovers from the gauntlet and prospers in the Massachusetts Bay Puritan colony, settling on an island in the Charles River and providing coastal trade between colonists and the natives. He sails from Maine to New Amsterdam, down to Virginia, and over to England. Later, he helps establish Wethersfield, Connecticut, the first English settlement on the Connecticut River. Sadly, in 1636 in Rhode Island, he and 5 of his crew are killed by natives. His 2 young nephews traveling with them are captured, and the ship's cargo is looted. This tragedy helps to spark the Pequot War. Oldham, also called Mad Jack, was known for his salty personality and may have aggravated the fight that killed him. Nevertheless, ministers across Massachusetts condemned the murders. His 2 young nephews, the only other family who came over, were saved by nearby fishermen and lived to grow up. Who else came on the Anne? Richard Warren had come on the Mayflower alone. His very capable wife and leader among the women, Elizabeth Walker Warren, was left behind with their 5 teenage daughters that she brings on the Anne. Do you think those girls were popular? They all married and all had children. Plus, Elizabeth and Richard have 2 sons after she arrives, including Nathaniel, one of my ancestors. Notice how William Bradford lists the younger boys before the older girls. Women had far fewer rights than even boys. Richard dies shortly after this census, but Elizabeth steps in for him and is the only woman allowed to sign official documents like property bill of sale. She is also the only woman in Plymouth called mistress as a sign of respect instead of goody like the other women. Hatter Deggery Priest left behind his wife Sarah Allerton, sister to Pilgrim Isaac, and 2 daughters, Mary and little Sarah, in Leiden, along with his business partner, Godbert Godbertson. When they hear that Deggery has died in Plymouth that first winter, they all come on the Anne as one new family. Researching some of the Pilgrims left behind, I found some of the great records the Dutch have left behind, and many have been transcribed and translated. Let's see if you can recognize some of the guests of this 1610 wedding record for William Pontus, bachelor fustian worker, and Wybra Hanson, young daughter, not spinster, like many of the women in the records. Do you recognize William Brewster? I hope so. Roger Wilson? No, he died 3 years later, leaving his house to the church. Edward Southworth? That was William Bradford's competitor for Alice, as you may recall. They show up together several times as friends of various grooms, so they are clearly friendly with each other, no hard feelings. Jane White Dickens was one of the 4 sisters White, including Bridget Robinson and Catherine Carver. That's it. But Anne Fuller was sister to Pilgrim brothers Edward and Dr. Samuel Fuller. Mary Butler, like many, she's simply lost to history. Wybra Hanson, the bride, was listed as a young daughter, not a spinster. A spinster spins wool into thread, like in its most common occupation of a grown woman in the 1600s, until she takes the more important job of wife and mother. Even then, she might be expected to continue to spin. If a woman's only job is to spin and never marries, she will continue to be called a spinster. Now you know why. Of course, we have a completely different connotation with it. We've had enough tragedy today, so I want to leave you with a happier story of success found on the Little James passenger list. Remember that one? The Jenny family and the Mortons. It was a very small ship, so just had a couple of families on it. In Leiden, Brewer's mate, John Jenny, marries Sarah Carey. I love that name, Sarah Carey, spinster. Soon they have Abigail and Samuel, while John grows in experience working with grain. As devoted pilgrims, they choose to travel together on the Little James. Sarah is heavy with child and will have 3 more children in Plymouth. Brewer John Jenny decides to pivot with the growing needs of the colony, and in 1636 becomes Miller Jenny by erecting the colony's third and most successful watermill for grinding popcorn into flour. It's still there. I've traveled and toured it, and you can see how it works and even buy some of the cornmeal. Nathaniel Morton calls Jenny a godly man, singular for publicness of spirit, setting himself to seek and promote the common good of New Plymouth. When John dies, his inventory includes several books, including a book of Psalms and a small globe, perhaps indicating some education and curiosity. Then Sarah runs a business until she dies at an old age. Her inventory includes the same books, but not the globe. Then Samuel takes over the business and the books. While still on the Little James, the Jennies are joined by a couple of bachelors and the 7 Mortons. Remember George Morton, who edited and published the embellished tales of their adventures so far? Pilgrim PR, called Mort's Relation. This retelling or relation of the story spreads quickly and brings even more immigrants to the colony. His very capable wife, Juliana Morton, helps Sarah Carey Jenny successfully give birth at sea. And their oldest son, Nathaniel Morton, becomes friends with John Jenny. Before the English Civil War starts in 1649, as many as 1,000 people a year are escaping England in the Great Migration, mostly due to Mort's relation. Like Faith Clark with her father, Thurston, who comes on the Francis in 34. She marries Pilgrim Edward Doty, originally a young servant who becomes rich, working for Isaac Allerton in the shipping business. They have 9 children, one of whom is my ancestor. 2 of them are fighting and feuding, and he actually puts it in the will that if they're fighting, they don't get anything from the will. Now we know my ancestors and those who were the influencers, those imprisoned, those who were needed by the flock, and those left behind at the shore. We've also met a few who were able to come over on later ships. While many more have disappeared into history, at least some of these unsung heroes now have had their moment in the spotlight.